Hello, I'm Matthew Winterbottom and I'm the curator of decorative art and sculpture at the Ashmolean Museum here in Oxford. I'm responsible for all the 3D objects in the Western art collections, everything really dating from the late medieval right through to the 21st century. Now, the object I've chosen today, which is meant to have an Easter theme, is a toast rack. Now, the reason I've chosen a toast rack is, of course, when we have a morning boiled egg for breakfast, we often have toast with it. So I thought it would be rather nice to choose this object. It's also a new gift or a recent gift to the museum. It was given to us last year by Mrs. D.D. Wigmore. Now, when we look at this object in front of us, we see a silver-coloured toast rack. It looks remarkably modern, and I think most people looking at it would think it was made probably in the 1920s or the 1930s. It has a kind of Art Deco modernist look to it. And most people are quite astounded when I actually tell them it was designed in 1881, a good 40 years earlier than we might have expected it to have been made. And this is part of a remarkable group of metalwork objects, all designed by a Victorian designer called Dr. Christopher Dresser, who is a remarkable man and isn't as well known as he should be. He's very famous amongst design historians and curators, but I think many of the members of the public don't really know who he is, which is rather a shame. And he was an exact contemporary of William Morris. Of course, he's much more famous and most people know who he is, but they were very, very different people. Whereas Morris rejected the Industrial Revolution and wanted to return to a pre-industrial heyday of medieval-inspired design made by hand in small collectives. Christopher Dresser realized that in order to bring good design to the masses, that he had to embrace modernism, had to embrace industrialization and industrial techniques to mass produce good designed objects. And he had one of the largest design workshops in Victorian Britain and produced designs for huge numbers of different manufacturers from across different materials, from carpets to wallpapers, to metalwork, to ceramics, to furniture, to glass. He designed it all for them. And he was very famous in his own day amongst the kind of middle-class design people who wanted to be assured of buying good, tasteful design in the kind of 1870s and the 1880s. And he was one of the first designers to insist that his name or his signature was actually included underneath many of the objects that he designed. And this was another innovative feature of Christopher Dresser. He was actually a product of the government schools of design that had been set up in the 1830s in order to produce a new generation of designers who would be able to create good design for the Victorian industrial manufacturers. Although Victorian Britain led the world in industry and industrial production, it was often thought to lag behind places like France in terms of good design. So this was a way of trying to improve Victorian design. Now, this object is remarkable because it looks so modern to us. It looks so out of time, I always think. I remember when I was much younger when I first came across Dresser's design, how shocked I was when I looked at them. And I thought, that's a Victorian design. It's not something we would expect to see from the 1880s. And that's because most Victorian design tends to be overloaded with quite a lot of ornament and decoration. And this was something the Victorians loved. And in fact, up until this point, most designs throughout history, most objects made by man are usually adorned with some kind of decoration. For us, of course, in a modernist world, we're used to objects devoid of decoration, where the function of the form pleases the eye in its own right. But when this was first made, this was fairly radical. This was a new radical approach. And when you look at it, you see there's no applied decoration. The decoration or the pleasing shape of it is part of its function. And the spokes of the arms of the toast rack are fitted into little balls. And they, again, are purely practical, but they form a decorative element. This is an entirely new radical way of thinking about an object. If you think of other Victorian silver plate of this period, usually there are scrolls, there are flowers, there's engraved decoration, there are cast elements. This has none of that. It's completely different. It's also made of EPNS, which is something called electroplated nickel silver, which was a new Victorian manufacturing process where you could mass produce something that looked like it was made of solid silver. In fact, it's made of a cheap metal called nickel, which is then covered in a very thin layer of silver using electricity. So it's a new product of this industrial revolution in Victorian Britain. These designs were very radical, and of course, it's very hard for us to think when we think of a large, groaning Victorian table with toast and kippers and eggs, bacon and devilled kidneys and kedgeree. To think of this very modern design is quite startling to us, but it is rather nice to think that this was there, and this was. It's always good, I think, to have our assumptions challenged about a particular period. Now, Christopher Dresser was almost forgotten about when he died. You know, when he died in 1904, his legacy was almost forgotten. People moved on, and it was only really in the 1960s when people saw these again that they were completely astounded, and museums started acquiring his work again. But we mustn't just think of him as being a kind of functionalist or a modernist. When we look at this, it's actually quite unlike many of his other works. And if you come to the museum and see this toast rack up in Gallery 66 in her Victorian gallery, you'll see cases with many other pieces designed by Christopher Dresser, which are highly ornamented. And Dresser was one of those very versatile Victorian designers where he could design what the client wanted. And he was also perfectly capable of designing very elaborate, very highly ornamented objects as well, if that's what the client wanted. And he was a great eclecticist. He was able to pillage the past and other cultures and take elements of design from all those different things and recombine them in a new and exciting way. He was also a pioneering ergonomic designer. He thought about how an object should be picked up and used and carried in the hand, and that would affect how the handle and how the shape of the object would work, which again we take for granted was something new at the time. He was also, and very importantly, he was the first designer to travel to Japan in the 19th century. Japan had been closed to most of the West for a very long time, for 200 years, and didn't let Western visitors into the country. And he visited famously in 1876-77 and was completely astounded by what he saw. And I think when you look at this object, which was designed a few years just after getting back from Japan, you see how the elements of Japanese design and Japanese aesthetics have also influenced his choice of object. This kind of spindly shape is almost like a kind of bamboo form, or again, that kind of sparing ornament is something that is a Japanese sort of a Japanese aesthetic, which was highly influential on Christopher Dresser. So it's only right, I think, that Dresser's legacy has been reassessed. You know, after being forgotten for so long, people are remembering who he is and really claiming him again as a precursor of modernist design. Thank you.